My guest at this time is former South Carolina Governor and former South Carolina Congressman Mark Sanford. He joins me today to discuss the impact of the growing national debt on our nation's future. So why does government spending remain out of control? Why does neither party seem to have much interest in doing anything about it? And what could actually help us reverse course at this point? We will get into all of those questions and more in the next several minutes. But first, Governor Sanford, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, just this past week, we learned from the Congressional Budget Office that our annual deficits for the current year and the following year are creeping closer to $1 trillion per year. And the Congressional Budget Office estimates we will add roughly $12.2 trillion in debt over the next decade, so over $1 trillion a year. Virtually no one in either party even reacted to that news, much less suggested doing anything about it. What will be the impact on our nation if our debt is $34 to $35 trillion a decade from now?
It's going to be horrendous, and opportunity will be lost for the next generation. You know, a deficit is nothing more than a deferred tax. And so what it means is you're doing the opposite of what the founding fathers talked about in terms of no taxation without representation. You are handing literally the bill for government that's consumed today to the next generation. So opportunities will be lost to the next generation. But really, this is not just a next generation problem. This is a problem wherein there is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, and we are growing ever closer to that moment. So I believe that we're walking away toward the most predictable financial crisis in the history of man. That is not something that will happen in the next generation, but it's going to happen in the next couple of years, because we're seeing the numbers flex out of control. The Congressional Budget Office numbers are not real. Those are really fairly conservative numbers. The reality is, and this is why there are a variety of different organizations like the Committee for Responsible Federal Government, I said those numbers could actually stretch to numbers closer to $2 trillion a year in operating deficit. The deficits that we're running are being run in peacetime and relatively calm economic waters. You reverse the economic waters and the deficits explode.
So when you talk about that this could be coming much sooner rather than later, like the next few years, perhaps in the next decade, we know there are projections, for example, that Medicare is going to be insolvent by 2026. It seems like a long way off, but that's only 7 years from now. So is that going to be the trigger, you think, for a much bigger financial issue, or will it be something else besides entitlements running out of control?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what lights the match that lights the fire. But we're playing with it. I mean, what's going on with trade right now could precipitate all of this. You know, if you look at global trade in the wake of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1930s, world trade declined by 2/3. Let me say that number again, 2/3. Imagine what would happen to our economy if all the goods that go in and out of the port of Charleston and Houston and San Francisco were cut by 2/3. All those trains and trucks crossing the country down by 2/3. So it could be trade. It could be just the fact that the financial markets recognize that, oh my goodness, this indeed is unsustainable. I mean, think about this. We will spend more on interest than we do on national defense in 36 months. In other words, that's not a kid or a grandkid kind of problem. That is our problem. That's why Admiral Mike Mullen, who is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when asked what's the biggest threat facing our country, answered, not the Chinese, not the Taliban, not the Russians. His answer was the American debt. And so our numbers are at a point of real alarm. And so what the debt has done is it's created an asset bubble. We may well be living in the likes of the 1920s and not even know it, just as the folks in the 1920s didn't know it at that time.
We're talking with former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford. And, sir, you were in your second stretch as a congressman when President Trump was elected in 2016. Once he was inaugurated, Republicans not only controlled the White House, they controlled the House and the Senate. You were not well received, though, when you wanted to use that opportunity to cut spending. What exactly did you propose, and what exactly did you hear from the likes of President Trump and your own leaders in response?
That it's not in vogue. I mean, the president's described himself as the king of debt. And so if you look at this, for instance, the latest debt deal that he just signed, this is after saying, I will never sign another debt deal like this. This one's indeed worse. And the last one was about 24 months ago. that debt deal adds $2 trillion of cumulative debt to our national debt overall, and it adds $1/3 trillion of debt or additional spending here over the next 2 years. And maybe part of it is he's just used to a lot of leverage in real estate deals. So everybody comes from a different path in where they start. But what worked for him there will not work for our country overall. And what he has done is he said, we're not going to touch the very drivers of our debt and spending. And as a consequence, you don't hear Republicans crossing him on that and saying, I'll do otherwise.
Why do the Republicans, why do the Democrats just pretend it's not a problem? Do they honestly think it's not going to become a problem on their watch? Do they feel like it's a political loser to try and figure out where to trim back? What's the reluctance here?
I think it's both. Nobody wants to have a bad day on their watch. And so let's just, put a finger in the dike for now and let somebody else deal with it down the road. So part of it's just a desire not to have a bad day in the world of politics. Part of it is it entails tough choices, and people don't want to make tough choices these days in politics. And part of it is just sort of what was described in the book years ago, popular delusions and the madness of crowds. If people get used to something being a certain way, generally they go with it until it breaks. And we are nearing that breaking point as you look at the accumulation of debt and deficits and spending in our country.
Well, you mentioned that the estimate of $34 to $35 trillion in debt by the end of next decade is actually pretty rosy, because when you throw in unfunded liabilities and other things, the red ink is a whole lot deeper. But we're really far in debt already. So what could realistically be done to deal with the problem if lawmakers actually wanted to deal with it?
Just change direction of the ship. I mean, we've been pointing a long way for a long time in one direction. That's toward more and more and more. And on the Democratic side, it's literally a debate at the presidential level of more versus more. And on the Republican side, there's just silence. I think all of us need to look for ways of speaking up and saying, this is an issue. The reason I'm contemplating this run for president is not because I think I could win. I don't think that for a second. But I do think that we might be able to elevate this all-important issue that is going to impact my life and your life and the kids or grandkids that follow us. And so, I think that what can be done is, one, talk about it, focus on it. Two is to change the direction of ship to more versus more, to why don't we just hold the line here? This is not sustainable. But that means we've got to have a national conversation on the ways in which it's not sustainable. Right now, we have the equivalent of pastry chefs in Washington. If you don't like this dessert, how about this one? How about this one? That's a far cry from the country doctor that used to say, you know what, this medicine isn't going to taste real good, but ultimately you will be much better off for it and it'll heal you. But this is why we need to go this route. That's, in essence, more the line of Abraham Lincoln or somebody along those lines. And so I think we need to have a national conversation. And then we need to recognize that, historically, we've been faced some much, much bigger problems than this. This is a problem of math. It's not a problem of certain enormous proportions that we've seen in the past. If we all jump in the boat together, and when Americans rally, we can solve problems. But right now we have my group versus your group, Republican versus Democrat, city versus country, and nobody wants to give an inch on their particular area of spending that means something to them. But if it's seen as a systemic and real threat, which is what Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, again described it as, I think we could do something about it. For that reason, I'm for the penny plan. Penny plan would say, wait a minute, what if we just cut a penny a year for 5 years? Oh, my goodness, look what happens to our deficits and our move toward a balanced budget if we just did that.
The big spender, of course, is entitlement reforms, and that's the one that everyone's reluctant to touch because they think it's the third rail of American politics. That used to be specifically for Social Security, but now, of course, Medicare is the one that's sooner to go insolvent. So any specific ideas on those fronts, whether it's raising the age of eligibility or if you're worth over a certain amount of money, maybe you just don't get it even though you've paid your taxes for it. How do we start to address the big drivers here?
The plan is predicated on saying, first of all, let's all get in the boat together. Let's recognize we got a problem. And what it does is it forces issue. Political bodies respond to a burning platform, not till something's at a crisis or near a crisis. Oftentimes do they respond to it. And so what this does is it says, if you guys don't come up with a plan, then it'll be across the board. And it forces targeted cuts. But that plan, the penny plan, is a penny a year from every program out there. That includes not just domestic discretionary defense, but also entitlements.
Governor, you mentioned a moment ago that you are considering a presidential run to draw a lot more attention to this issue because it's not getting enough attention right now. As I look at the 2020 field, though, William Weld is already running. He doesn't seem to get a lot of coverage. There's a lot of Democratic candidates who aren't getting much coverage either. So how much more attention do you think this would get if you became a formal candidate? I
don't know. That's the wild card. That's why I've paused for more than a year as different friends have brought this up and suggested it and pushed it. That's the wild card. You might just end up a human pinata, nothing more than that. Or you might end up a human pinata and be able to elevate this issue. If it's the first, I've got no interest in doing it. And yet I'll put up with some pain if I could get the message across. And the question is, how real is that second basket? And that's what I'm looking at. I do think that on the Democratic side, it's amazing to me. I watched the two first Democratic presidential debates. There was not one sentence allocated to debt or deficit or government spending. And the first key to fixing the problem is recognizing you got a problem and actually talking about it. So if I do it, that's what I would intend to do in every vehicle possible.
What's the best way to connect to the American public? If the candidates aren't talking about it, getting the attention of the American people obviously is the way to go. In 2010, the Tea Party wave, it was certainly an issue, but it certainly seemed to ebb since then. How do you convince the American people to get in the same boat and row together if it hasn't been a priority for them either?
Well, I think, I keep going back to, and I may be wrong in this presumption, but it seems to me that there's a disconnect between political leadership that, to your point, absolutely does not talk about it or focus on it, and the thousands and thousands of people I met over my 25 years in the political process that were, small business and struggling to make it and cared very much about numbers. You talk to folks, you'd be invited into their home, you sit down and they've got the family checkbook out and they're sitting around the kitchen counter saying, here's what we're struggling with. Those people haven't disappeared. And so I would certainly cede the fact that it has disappeared as a political movement. But those people are still there, and the angst that they feel on family or business finances, I think still extends to what they see going on at the federal government.
Well, it is a massive issue that, as we've already said here, way too few people are talking about in any substantive or significant way. So, Governor, thank you very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for letting me join you. I sure appreciate it.
Former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford, I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.